Hello everyone. My name is Laya Kuhar. I'm a member of the program committee of the Institute for Labor Studies, and I would like to thank you all for joining us today for the first lecture in the series of lectures on the topic of biopolitics organized by the Institute for Labor Studies. With this series of lectures, we are officially reopening the activities of the ILS. As you've probably noticed, we've made a total makeover of the Institute. We've changed our logo, our webpage, the program committee. We also have new plans for future activities. However, we have decided to continue with some activities of the that were being organized by the members of the previously existing Institute for Labor Studies and Workers' Parents University Collective. And by organizing this series of lectures, we are therefore in some way continuing the work done by our colleagues in the past. So for this year's series of lectures, we've chosen the topic of biopolitics. We have chosen biopolitics mainly because we would like to present a theoretical reflection of the current situation connected to the COVID-19 pandemic. We believe that such theoretical reflection is crucial for understanding what is currently happening in the world. By talking about biopolitics and other related phenomena from different perspectives and theoretical frameworks, we would like to present a better understanding of both the pandemic and topics related to the concept of biopolitics in general. So we will start this series of lectures on the topic of the possibility of democratic biopolitics. And later on, we will also discuss the economic consequences of the current pandemic, the eugenics in Slovenia, the concept of biopolitics in new materialist theories, necropolitics, the social reproduction theory, and so on. The lectures will take place every Thursday at 7 p.m. And if you are interested in the whole series, you can check it out on our webpage. So before I introduce our first guest, I would like to make two technical remarks. First remark is please subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can do that by clicking the red button below this video on YouTube. If you do not want to subscribe to our YouTube channel, you can subscribe to our Facebook or Twitter account. And if you don't use social media, then you can subscribe to our mailing list. You can also do that by going in the commentary section below this video and click the link subscribe. I can promise you that we will not spam you with our emails. You will only get one email every week on Monday. So the second remark is regarding the questions. You can pose a question to the lecturer by writing a comment on the commentary section in YouTube. So there is on the right side of the video, there is a commentary section, and you can write your remark or question during the lecture or after the lecture. And at the end, I will choose the best or the few of your comments and present them to Panagiotis Sotiris. So without further ado, I'm really happy that we can inaugurate the series of lectures with Panagiotis Sotiris. Panagiotis Sotiris works as a journalist in Athens and teaches at the Hellenic Open University. He's a member of the Historical Materialism editorial board. His most recent book is A Philosophy for Communism, Rethinking Althusser, that was published at Brill this year. He has published several professional and scientific articles on the topic of the COVID-19 pandemic, including article Against Ungovernment, Is a Democratic Biopolitics Possible, published by Critical Legal Thinking in March this year, and Thinking Beyond the Lockdown on the Possibility of a Democratic Biopolitics, published by Historical Materialism this September. This is actually not the first time that Panagiotis Sotiris is giving the lecture for ILS. He was already here, I think 5 or 6 years ago when he was talking about imperialism. However, the title of his lecture today is On a Possibility of a Democratic Biopolitics. So I'm giving the word to Panagiotis.
Okay, first of all, many thanks for this invitation. It was actually more than 6 years ago. It was April 2014 when I was in Ljubljana and gave a lecture on theories of imperialism, and I really enjoyed the rich discussion. And it's very good that the work done by the Institute of Labor Studies is continued, and this series of lectures seems really interesting. So I'm going to do a presentation today that for a large part will be, one might say, philological, in the sense that I would really go back into Foucault and how the notion of biopolitics emerges in his work and the many tensions that run through it, in order to rethink through Foucault the possibility of what I try to define tendentially as democratic biopolitics, before at the end of the presentations I attempt to see how all these are pertinent to contemporary discussions about the COVID-19 pandemic. So, I mean, we all know that the notion of biopolitics has been associated with the relationship between health, politics, racism, and social antagonism. And since its introduction by Michel Foucault in the 1970s, it has led to a growing body of research. Before going to Foucault, I would like to see how Giorgio Agamben also holds an important place in such discussions, because in particular, he had a great influence on such a conception of a sovereign biopolitical power, and how it was related to the formation of contemporary states of exception, and how it has also had a great influence on contemporary debates on biopolitics. And I will use Agamben's reading of Foucault's biopolitics as the starting point to go back into Foucault and then again back to the pandemic. As we know, for Agamben, the novelty, and I quote from him, the novelty of modern biopolitics lies in the fact that the biopolitical given is as such immediately political, and the political is as such immediately the biological given. This is the end of the quote. And he finds this especially in Nazism, from eugenics to the Holocaust, as the main example. And it's interesting and well known that at the beginning of the current pandemic, Agamben took a strong stance against the first restrictions imposed in Italy, suggesting that they were imposing an authentic state of exception, and that the invention of an epidemic offered the ideal pretext for further limitations to basic freedoms. And even when he received a lot of criticism for this position, he insisted that people have been so habituated to live in, and I quote from him, to live in conditions of perennial crisis and perennial emergency, that they don't seem to notice that their life has been reduced to a purely biological condition, and has not only has lost not only every social and political dimension, but also any human and affective. A society that lives in a perennial state of emergency cannot be a free society. We, in fact, live in a society that has sacrificed freedom to so-called reasons of security, and has therefore condemned itself to live in a perennial state of fear and insecurity. This is the end of the quote. And he has continued making such interventions during the pandemic, insisting that there is a danger that practices such as social distancing could become the model of politics that awaits us. And I quote from him, advantage will be taken of this distancing to substitute digital technological apparatuses everywhere in place of human physicality, which as such becomes suspect of contagion, political contagion, let it be understood, end of quote. although I mean, one can be really critical of Agamben's initial underestimation of the severity of the pandemic, and also can be critical and needs to be critical of how he treats all forms of physical distancing as a suspension of sociality, or also be critical of how Agamben tends to trivialize the very notion of state of exception or exaggerate. For example, it's difficult to say that university teachers accepting to teach online can be compared to those pledging their allegiance to fascism. However, I think that we can use Agamben as a starting point because it poses an important question that I would like to revisit by means of going back into Foucault. And the question is, what is the choice we are facing? Are we facing a choice between simply doing nothing, thus being in danger of an unmitigated pandemic, or the other solution is coercive and authoritarian restrictions and lockdowns? So I would take this question, which is very important, and it's also urgent, since especially in Europe we are going back into lockdowns, despite the fact that they didn't actually prove to be so successful, at least in terms of reducing mortality in the first wave of the pandemic, and they have all this social and psychological and in the long run health cost associated with them. So I think it's also urgent to see if this is the choice facing us. If, for example, it is lockdowns are unavoidable, and the other solution would be, having all the dangers associated with the pandemic. And I would like to suggest that, in contrast to such a false dichotomy, it is possible to think of a politics that could deal with public health by means of democratic participation, collective discussion, democratization of knowledge, a politics that could include changes in behavior, including forms of physical distancing as practices of collective responsibility and solidarity, and not as a suspension of sociality, but would not be limited to them. And I think that such a perspective could help us find ways to go beyond the limits of the lockdown strategy, think of health in ways that take account of social determinants and capital relations of production or reproduction, and also inscribe the fight against the pandemic within a socialist strategy. So I choose to describe this as a form of democratic biopolitics. I know that the use of the word biopolitics might sound, in the context of democratic biopolitics, in this syntagm, might sound like an oxymoron, since biopolitics is usually being used as a negative term. But I would like to insist, based on the one hand, on an insistence that notions such as biopolitics have a relational and thus more open character, and two, on the possibility of reading the notion of biopolitics by means of Foucault's later work and notions such as courage of truth and care of self. And I would also try to show how this perspective can be inscribed within a Marxist perspective that acknowledges the centrality of class antagonism. But to do so requires to go back to Foucault's trajectory, which is rather complex, and more complex than this idea of Foucault having like a very coherent and ready-made program. In fact, Foucault had a very open, almost experimental research project from the early 1970s to his death in 1984, which was in a certain way experimental. He tested notions and concepts, especially using his Collège de France lectures as the testing ground. And sometimes, by the time his published work had already had some kind of, let's say, impact, people had been translated, it had been started to be read, especially outside of France, Foucault had already moved some steps forward in the elaboration of this conceptual framework. Now, the starting point is disciplinary power. And I read the definition that Foucault offers in his lectures on the punitive society. And I quote from Foucault: "It seemed to be a fact that we live in a society of disciplinary power, that is to say, a society equipped with apparatuses whose form is sequestration, whose purpose is the formation of a labor force, and whose instrument is the acquisition of disciplines or habit." This is the first definition he gives of disciplinary power. Now, for Foucault, disciplinary power did not simply replace sovereign power, the form of power that emerges at the beginning of modernity. Since the logic of sovereignty persisted as a means to counter monarchy and other obstacles to disciplinary power, and as a system of juridical rights that enables and conceals the effectivity of disciplinary power. So we can say that at the dawn of modernity, you have the emergence of this conception of sovereign power, which is not purely fully replaced by disciplinary power, but it is disciplinary power, this normalization of bodies to fit into forms of capitalist exploitation that forms the real form of power associated with the emergence of capitalist socialist relations. Because if we see disciplinary power, it's not just about discipline in the sense of coercion. In Foucault, disciplinary power has what one might say a productive, a positive, in quotation marks, aspect. It has to do with norms, normalization of how bodies become productive. And most of the texts associated with disciplinary power mark the high point of Foucault's engaging with a dialogue with Marx. And we have Foucault in interviews or under interventions stressing this aspect. Now, at the same time, many of Foucault's writings from that period that dealt with questions about health, sexuality, or the prison system seem to fall under this conception of disciplinary power and offered a way to think about these institutions beyond mere oppression, thus enabling a critical thinking of how they were not neutral, they were not socially neutral, they were traversed by class strategies. And this is also the main point, the theoretical ground of Discipline and Punish, which, especially after it was translated into English, introduced this conception of disciplinary power to a broader audience. I stress this distinction between discipline power and biopolitics proper, because the notion of biopolitics, along with the notion of biopower, emerged in Foucault's writings as an attempt to see a form of power that moves beyond discipline and also changes the focus from abstractions of individual or society to the materiality of the body. And at the beginning, the formulation of this definition seemed rather tentative. For example, if we see it the way biopower and biopolitics are defined in both the first volume of History of Sexuality, another book that, because it was relatively early, both published and also translated into other languages, also had an impact, and The Society Must Be Defended, lectures from Collège de France, we can see this tentative formulation, that how Foucault pointed towards a certain vision of power over life that defined a broader historical epoch. I mean, in a certain way, both disciplinary power and biopolitics are about power over life, are about some form of biopower, but he draws an important line of demarcation between anatomopolitics and biopolitics proper, not in the sense of an historical succession, first one form, then another one, but more like different coexisting and to a certain degree complementary modalities of power in the epoch of capitalism and the hegemony of capitalist social forms. And I quote from Foucault a well-known passage on this distinction. Starting in the 17th century, this power over life evolved into basic forms. These forms were not antithetical, however. They constituted rather two poles of development, linked together by a whole intermediary cluster of relations. One of these poles, the first to be formed, it seems, centered on the body as a machine, its disciplining, the optimization of its capabilities, the extortion of its forces, the parallel increase of its usefulness and its docility, its integration into systems of efficient and economic controls. All this was ensured by the procedures of power that characterize the disciplines and anatomopolitics of the human body. The second, formed somewhat later, focused on the species body, the body imbued with the mechanics of life and serving as the basis of the biological processes, propagation, birth and mortality, the level of health, life expectancy and longevity, with all the conditions that can cause this to vary. Their supervision was effected through an entire series of interventions and regulatory controls, a biopolitics of the population. So in the beginning, he tries to see disciplinary power and biopolitics proper as two aspects of the same form of power over life and bodies, but also stressing the difference. And I think that gradually Foucault moves towards a greater distancing between disciplinary power and biopolitics proper. For example, in the Security Territory Population lectures at the Collège de France, Foucault made a distinction between disciplinary apparatuses and the apparatus of security. Security, as I will try to show, it's an important concept, not like the usual connotations we usually associate with it. And it's interesting how the example he uses of the distinction between discipline and security is the different handling of the plague and smallpox. The difference between quarantines and vaccination or inoculation. And I will quote again from Foucault. The fundamental problem will not be the imposition of discipline, although discipline may be called on to help, so much as the problem of knowing how many people are infected with smallpox at what age, with what effects, with what mortality rates, lesions or after effects, the risks of inoculation, the probability of an individual dying or being infected by smallpox despite inoculation, and the statistical effects of the population in general. In short, it will no longer be the problem of exclusion, as with leprosy, or of quarantine, as with the plague, but of epidemics and the medical campaigns that try to halt epidemic or endemic phenomena. And it is on the basis of this that Foucault tries to see the different modality of power associated with a more disciplinary approach. He identifies it with the quarantine measures adopted on the plague, and this management of population health dynamics associated with mass vaccination campaigns, beginning with the attempt to eradicate smallpox. Now, Foucault attempted to trace how this conception of security can also be linked to the way problems like scarcity are being treated by means of the mechanism of the market, and how this induces the emergence of a new modality of power. And here things get also really, really interesting, since here also Foucault makes a distinction between discipline as a form of power, as security as a form of power practices, are also associated with the market. And I will quote from him: discipline is essentially centripetal. I mean that discipline functions to the extent that it isolates a space, that it determines a segment. Discipline concentrates, focuses, and encloses. The first action of discipline is, in fact, to circumscribe a space in which its power and the mechanism of its power will function fully and without limit. It isolates, it concentrates, it encloses, it is protectionist, and it focuses essentially on action in the market or in the space of the market and what surrounds it. In contrast, the apparatus of security have the constant tendency to expand. They are centrifugal. New elements are constantly being integrated. production, psychology, behavior, the ways of doing things of producers, buyers, consumers, importers and exporters, and the world market. I think that this distinction between these two complementary modalities of power associated with capitalist modernity is really important, because it sheds light that it's not only about coercion. There's also what he defines as security, which is how the dynamics of the market of this expansion are in a certain way also power practices, practices that also produce effects in the way that disciplinary practices produce, is also really fruitful. And it's here that also Foucault encounters liberalism, and how a certain freedom of movement becomes an essential aspect of this new technology of power. And Foucault used as examples the new forms of countering endemic diseases through inoculation and vaccination, an approach not focused on simple protection, but rather on the constant management of risk. Moreover, this pointed towards a relationship between government and population that cannot be limited to the disciplinary relation, since it involves calculating, managing, regulating both risk and the desires of the population. And it is here that we found this connection between biopolitics and the emergence of political economy and liberalism, the new forms of political power associated with the dynamics of capitalist accumulation, the relationship between population and individuals. And it is exactly this that he calls the research project on governmentality. I think this is also a really fruitful and an important turning point in Foucault's thinking, because already he has offered this very original idea of disciplinary power as a power that normalizes and produces productive bodies, not just coerces. This was the idea of how it was often read in the 1970s or 1980s, this idea of a panoptic coercive force, whereas the crucial aspect is how it produces productive bodies that accept norms and behave in the necessary ways that make them suitable for capitalist exploitation, and how he expands this with the notion of biopolitics, and how he combines political economy, liberalism, and this idea of management of dynamics rather than simple imposing a pattern. And it's really interesting how he defines governmentality. And I quote from Foucault again: "By this word governmentality, I mean three things. First, the ensemble formed by institutions, procedures, analyses and reflections, calculations and tactics that allow the exercise of this specific, albeit very complex power that has the population as its target, political economy as its major form of knowledge, and apparatuses of security as its essential technical instrument. Second, the tendency has constantly led towards the preeminence over all other of power, sovereignty, discipline, and so on, of the type of power that we can call government. Finally, by governmentality, the process, or rather the result of the process by which the state of justice of the Middle Ages becomes the administrative state in the 15th and 16th century and was gradually governmentalized." I think this is a very rather tense except from Foucault, which defines a research program into the complexity of power associated with emergence and reproduction of capitalism. I mean, it points exactly that it's not simply about economic practices and then some form of coercion that guarantees it, but rather that a very complex interplay between state apparatuses, economic practices, and all those emerging power dispositives that have to do with, the well-being, the health, the normality of societies. And it's interesting how it is exactly the expansion of the notion of biopolitics, the way that biopolitics sort of distances itself from simple discipline, that is at the center of this decision by Foucault to embark on a project on governmentality, and which in its turn makes Foucault to go back into this large project of reading the various forms of the art of government in history, beginning with antiquity. And because actually he would move in two directions. The first would be the linkage between liberalism and biopolitics. This is the essence of birth of biopolitics lectures, and everyone who has gone through these lectures has this kind of surprise, because he begins to talk about biopolitics, and then he sets aside this question and goes back into the genealogy of liberalism, and also the proto-neoliberalism of the German Ordoliberalismus current, which was at that point still dominant in a certain way, or emerged, and before the emergence of English-speaking neoliberalism. And the second is exactly the genealogy of the thinking of the art of government. And it's also really interesting how within this context, the context of going back into the forms of art of government, but also Foucault goes back into other notions coming from antiquity, such as care of self and parrhesia, courage for the truth. Whereas at the same time, he remains with this very fascinating idea of the nominalism of power that already he expresses in the first volume of History of Sexuality, namely the idea that instead of offering a foundationalist definition of power, it is much better to actually study practices and networks of power in the plural, in their actual functioning. Now, this move from biopolitics to governmentality has been, of course, the object of much discussion, and a large part of this discussion has to do with the politics of Michel Foucault. And because Foucault makes this association between biopolitics and biopower and the emergence of liberal and neoliberal governmentality, there has been a discussion that it's really risky to reappropriate such notions. And there is a growing body of literature suggesting that in a certain way this coincides with Michel Foucault's disillusionment with the radicalism of the late 60s and early 70s, and his move, let's say, politically to the right, towards more social democratic or neoliberal positions. I would try to suggest that I'm not really convinced, not in the sense of whatever Foucault was thinking, but in the sense of what is the actual dynamic of the concepts themselves. Because I think that what is missed in certain such discussions is the dynamic and relational character of Foucault's notions. Disciplinary power, biopolitics, governmentality, it did refer modalities of power within the emergence of capitalism. It's true, disciplinary power, as already mentioned, points towards the social production of productive subjects and a labor power able to adapt to capitalist exigencies of productivity, whereas the notions of biopolitics, biopower, and governmentality expand and transform this in order to incorporate the new and expansive forms of sociability and politicity associated with capitalism, beginning the dominant mode of production. But I think that it is exactly the way the notion of politics attempts to expand and transform the initial conception of disciplinary power into power practices that attempt to manage, regulate, and to a certain extent incorporate these expansive new social and political practices associated with modernity and capitalism, makes these notions much more relational, because the terrain of their exercise is much, by definition, antagonistic and conflictual. And I think that this offers the possibility of a form of biopolitics and to a certain extent governmentality that is antagonistic to both the paradigm of sovereignty and the paradigm of the market and political economy, the paradigm, let's say, of biopolitics proper and liberalism, a form of biopolitics conditioned by the force of subaltern struggles. And I would dare to give an analogy. If we go to Gramsci, we can see how Gramsci studies the emergence of hegemony. Hegemony as the particular complex modality of power in the bourgeois era. How the bourgeoisie, in order to actually maintain its class dominance, has to have this much broader conception of power that is not limited to simple coercion. It also incorporates all the emerging forms of politicity coming from civil society, while at the same time, maintaining class rule. So this is what Gramsci studies when he studies the hegemony of the bourgeoisie, the emergence and the history of the emergence of this hegemony. But at the same time, he suggests the possibility of an antagonistic hegemony of the subaltern, not as a simple replacement in the role of hegemon, but something different in form, content, and practice. And so I'm using this analogy to suggest that in a similar way, we can think of the possibility of a democratic biopolitics or antagonistic form of biopolitics that goes beyond disciplinary power and market. By the way, it is interesting that when Foucault defines biopower, he also makes an interesting analogy with hegemony, and I will read a small paragraph from Foucault to that, and it goes like, this biopower was without question an indispensable element in the development of capitalism. The latter would not have been possible without the controlled insertion of bodies into the machinery of production in the adjustment of the phenomena of population to economic processes. But this was not all it required. It also needed the growth of both this factor, their reinforcement, as well as their availability and docility. It had to have methods of power capable of optimizing forces, aptitudes, and life in general, without at the same time making them more difficult to control. If the development of the great instruments of the state as institutions of powers ensured the maintenance of production relations, the rudiments of anatomo and biopolitics created in the 18th century as techniques of power, present at every level of the social body and utilized by very diverse institutions, the family, the army, schools, and the police, individual medicine, and the administration of collective bodies, operated in the sphere of economic processes, their development, and the forces working to sustain them. They also acted as factors of segregation and social hierarchism, exerting their influence on the respective forces of both these movements, guaranteeing relations of domination and effects of hegemony. The adjustment of the accumulation of men to that of capital, the joining of the growth of human groups to the expansion of productive forces, and the differential allocation of profit were made possible in part by the exercise of biopower in its many forms and modes of application. So if you look at something like that from Foucault, you see exactly many analogies between biopower, biopolitics, and in a certain way hegemony, because they all relate to the same question, this complex form of power, the complexity of the very phenomenon of power in capitalist modernity, where power does not only come from above, from the coercive apparatus of the state detached from production, but also in a certain way emerges from the very pores of economic practices in the everyday transactions, and also in the everyday forms of social interaction, social discourse, and collective practices. So, and I think that the research project of governmentality in a certain way attempted to see the complexity of this process. So, and I also, and it's also interesting if we go to the choice that Foucault made, which to go back to the discussion of the art of government, care of self, and parrhesia, courage of truth, which is also this research project on the genealogy of forms of subjectivity and the relations between power and truth. But I think that this is not an abandonment of the previous research on disciplinary power and biopolitics, but I also think it's also an expansion, a way to rethink how forms of subjectivity are produced, how regimes of truth are emerge, and also how this can be articulated with practices of care of self, which is also at the same time Foucault's way to think with the idea, the idea of experimentation with new forms of social relations, practices, and subjectivities. And I also think that is why I insist that all these references to care for the self do not suggest a primacy of the individual over the collective, which means that we can in a certain way reappropriate this notion and talk about a collective care of the self. Because it is Foucault that insists that care for self is ethical in itself, but it implies complex relations with others. And I think that a very important observation has been made by Judith Revel, who has stressed that Foucault also used the notion of the way of life, which marks his distancing for any form of individualism. And I quote from Revel, "A way of life," Foucault tells us, "is an ethics, a way of living together. It is stricto sensu a gesture which constitutes a shared space in an entirely new way. This constitution, so far removed from the institutions that Foucault casts in a negative light. This political character of ethics goes counter to those interpretations that see in Foucault's texts of the 1980s a retreat from politics and its replacement by an ethics understood as some kind of return to morality or to the reassuring order of values. Ethics in Foucault is neither a moral nor an individualist or egoist retreat. Ethics means the problematization of the common, which is constructed on the basis of difference and puts these differences to work in a new way of leading one's life." I think that this observation is really important. It points to how Foucault's seemingly individualist or ethical turn in the 1980s in fact points towards an agonistic, one might say, conception of human life that is not individualistic, it is more collective. And it is true that Foucault, on a personal level, was disillusioned with the politics of the radical movements, but I'm not sure he became a liberal or a classical liberal in his final years. And I would suggest as a reference point the way he revisits the cynics in his last series of courses at the Collège de France, because he finds them a conception of militancy that would return in later epochs. And I think that the way he presents the ethical importance and significance of militancy in these lectures clearly is not the work of someone who is liberal in attitude. And I quote from Foucault, "And then the third important way of being militant is militancy as bearing witness by one's life in the form of a style of existence, the style of existence specific to revolutionary militantism, and ensuring that one's life bears witness, breaks and has to break with the conventions, habits, and values of society, and it must manifest directly by its visible form, its constant practice, and its immediate existence, the concrete possibility and the evident value of another life, which is the true life. Here again, right at the center of the experience of the life of revolutionary militantism, you find the theme so fundamental, at the same time so enigmatic and interesting, of the true life, of that problem of the true life, which was already raised by Socrates, and which I do not think has ceased to run through all Western thought." So this is a very fascinating excerpt from one of the last lectures by Foucault, where he stresses how militancy as the opening of another life, a new, truer form of living, that clearly marks a break with liberalism. And it's interesting that in the same lecture, Foucault criticizes the French Communist Party for exactly abandoning this aspect of revolutionary militancy and by embracing a conformist approach to questions of way of life. So I would suggest that instead of liberalism, later Foucault points towards the constant search for alternatives, the constant production of heterotopias, to use another notion from Foucault. And it's interesting, this passage, which is the last page of the manuscript of his last 1984 lecture at Collège de France. And this goes like, but what I would like to stress in conclusion is this: there is no establishment of the truth without an essential position of otherness. The truth is never the same. There can be truth only in the form of the other world and the other life. L'autre monde et de la vie autre. I also quoted the French original. So I think this idea of another world, another life, is exactly a rephrasing of the constant need for heterotopias, for radical alternatives. And I think that in this way, and in a certain way, even daring to read, Foucault of biopolitics by means of later Foucault, we can indeed talk about a democratic biopolitics. What would mean that? Well, this would point towards the direction of a possibility to rethink questions of health and care as part of a broader attempt to radically transform social relations and experiment with new forms of social organization and collective struggle. In a certain way, it is an attempt to rethink biopolitics by means of new forms of care for ourselves. I use the plural consciously, and the emergence of new ways of life antagonistic to the logic of capital, but also as an attempt to rethink parrhesia and the courage of truth as constant production of discourses and knowledges that engage with the situation of the subaltern classes. And I think that in the contemporary context, such a perspective can help us deal with the many forms of vulnerability that the reproduction of capitalism constantly induces. It can help us acknowledge the complex, overdetermined ways in which the social, the political, and the ideological are articulated in the social determinations of health, morbidity, and mortality, aspects which even the dominant discourse on the pandemic tends to underestimate. For example, we all talk about transmission chains and how they can be stopped, and no one talks about how susceptibility and vulnerability to such pathogens and consequently mortality is in a certain way socially produced not only by lack of access to public health, but also by the effects on human health of inequality, socioeconomic stress, and if you, in a certain way, the many ecologies of disease associated with contemporary capitalism, which also, in a way, is a way both to reconnect to a long tradition of radical thinking on questions of health that pointed towards the importance of the social dimension, but also with another important element from that tradition, that large advances in human health were the result of improved social conditions rather than just medical interventions. For example, back in the 1970s, Ivan Illich encapsulated that in a rather provocative way, and I quote from his medical nemesis: a world of optimal and widespread health is obviously a world of minimal and only occasional medical intervention. Healthy people are those who live in healthy homes on a healthy diet in an environment equally fit for birth, growth, work, healing, and dying. They are sustained by a culture that enhances the conscious acceptance of limits to population, of aging, of incomplete recovery, and ever imminent death. I think that this idea, this more, let's say, integral conception of health is something that can resonate with a conception of democratic biopolitics, and it's pertinent to contemporary challenges, agencies and exigencies such as the pandemic, because it enables to incorporate this broader conception of care that is not limited to health care and can also offer an answer to the crisis of care in the era of financialized capitalism. So this is what I tried to suggest initially as an idea of biopolitics beyond both disciplinary power and liberal security. And I would even try to suggest tentatively that this idea of a democratic biopolitics can also be linked to the question whether there can be a communist governmentality, or if you prefer, the art of self-government of the subaltern, that is, a transformative, participatory, experimental, and democratic new practice of politics that would enable a potential subaltern self-government. Which, of course, such an idea of communist governmentality also points to a very open question in regards to radical politics today. How can we rethink political praxis and really project an alternative way to organize society in ways that, you know, avoid both sectarian self-isolation, but also, you know, traditional electoral politics and the idea that, you know, radical politics is just radical measures, and reconnect with that tradition in Marxism, that Marxism is about a new practice of politics. And I think this is also very pertinent to the discussions on the pandemic. This is the final part of my presentation, because I do believe that we need to think in terms of an alternative to both the neoliberal cynicism, with its treatment of the poor and the vulnerable as surplus populations, but also the coercive and disciplinary logic of the lockdown, especially since it is combined with the constant exposure of those that cannot stay home, and the tragic lack of preparedness, which is repeated, that led to mass deaths at care facilities and nursing homes. And I think that to do that, we also need to have an understanding of what are the actual, you know, thanatopolitics or necropolitics of neoliberal capitalism, which are not limited to the exposure to infections. This is an important aspect, how neoliberal policies and neoliberal globalization enhances the emergence of new pathogens, but it's not that. I mean, capitalism does not kill simply, or contemporary capitalism to be more exact, by simply enabling the emergence of new pathogens, but also with, and more importantly, so with social inequality, precariousness, and socio-economic stress, and how all these increase the actual vulnerability of population. Because, for example, if we see one of the tragedies of the contemporary pandemic, which is the increased mortality of people from minorities background, the poorer people, you can see that, for example, the increased mortality of Black Americans in relation to whites. There you can see how vulnerability is socially produced by lack of access to health care, by worse living conditions, worse nutritional practices, and much more precariousness and socioeconomic stress. And we know, for example, from sociologists of health, that inequality by itself is a determinant of health, and a negative determinant of health. If we take two countries with the same, let's say, level of living and the same access to health services, the one that is more unequal has, and consequently has greater inequalities and greater socioeconomic stress, tends to be to have worse health indicators. So I think this is really important to think in a more holistic, one might say, way, how capitalism presents dangers to human health. And moreover, such an approach of democratic biopolitics would, in a certain way, refuse this idea of the suspension of sociality that is inherent in the very notion of social distancing. And I would like to say that although it has been like kind of, trendy to say that physical distancing is not social distancing, if you go back into the literature and how this concept emerged, especially in regards to preparations for a big flu pandemic already in the 2000s, the idea is social distancing is to have less social interaction, and this has a very strong, in a certain way, neoliberal disciplinary overtone. And so the question is, how do you recreate conditions of sociality, solidarity, and care, struggle and resistance? Because one might say that the struggle, the very notion of struggle, the very notion of movement is an agonistic renegotiation of vulnerability. And I think this, as I already said, this is not just a theoretical question. This is an important political question. If you look at Europe now, at the moment, you have all the elements of the failure of the lockdown strategy, since it failed to avert many deaths in the spring and had tremendous social, economic, and psychological cost. And now you have another lockdown, and you have it with more resentment or even protest against it, very, very contradictory, of course. And you have all this problem with people, that are deniers of the virus, etc., very obscurantist or irrational. But it is indeed a challenge to see that we know that the cost of such measures, such as the lockdowns, which is economic, depression, unemployment, and negative psychological aspects, is not only economic. In the long run, it will also mean a cost in human lives from precarious socioeconomic stress, alcohols, or substance abuse, or suicides. And it is sad to say that, these kinds of deaths, we do not read daily statistics. In the same way that, for example, in countries like Greece, who went 10 years ago through a social shock therapy by means of the austerity imposed by the EU and the IMF, and now we're beginning to see also some of the health implications of these measures. You don't have, like daily bulletins saying how many, heart problems or cancers earlier than where they were supposed to occur happen and can be related causally to that very, very aggressive deterioration of social conditions and extreme precariousness and socioeconomic stress caused by austerity politics. And I think that this is important because the idea of the politics of health is not simply a technical issue, and it's not simply about access to health services, however important this is. It's really important to have public health systems with full coverage, fully free for everyone, for the public, etc. But I think that a communist orientation has also an idea of how people can have to live longer, better, and happier lives, which means, for example, different priorities such as prevention of a treatment. You needed to be community-based rather than separated for social life, and you needed to be based on the possibility for the socialization of knowledge, so that people, instead of simply relying on the ability to reach the health system, can also themselves practice a collective care of themselves. And I think that if you think of this kind of alternative biopolitics in the horizon in a communist horizon, you can find historical experience that can be used as points of reference. For example, if you go back to the battle against HIV, the fight against stigma, the attempt to make people understand that it's not the disease of high-risk groups, the demand for education on safe sex practices. If you know, in a certain way, the very idea of safe sex instead of legally enforced abstinence, as it was discussed in the early phases of the HIV pandemic, and also the demand for funding for the development of therapeutic measures and access to public health. All these were the result of movements, of a struggle, movements like ACT UP, but actually it's interesting, they not only struggled for access to health services, but also defended communities and their own identity and strengths of solidarity. So this is an example, one might say, of a movement of biopolitical movement practices. Or one could go also to how the Black Panthers had their strategy, which they called survival pending revolution, which focus on breakfast programs, schools, clothing programs, and also free medical clinics, including also a national testing program for sickle cell anemia, which was really important if you see it, a political movement organizing a national testing program from a form of anemia that was endemic to the Black American population. And you can also see other examples. If you read Paul Richards and his writing on how the Ebola pandemic was fought, the last Ebola epidemic, not pandemic, gladly we don't have an Ebola pandemic, that would have been terrible. But the 2014-2015 Ebola epidemic, which was the biggest one, he stressed in his reading of how it was fought, the emergence of a people science, a collective learning processes. And he has this phrase where communities learned to think like epidemiologists and epidemiologists to think like communities. If you take this phrase, this is exactly the challenge still facing. Because if you look at government practices, if you look at expert groups associated with governments, you have epidemiologists that do not think like communities. For example, just saying, lock down everything. This is an inability to think like a community. And also no one helps communities to think like epidemiologists, to realize how their own everyday practices can or cannot contribute to the expansion of an epidemic. I think this is one of the challenges. And you can see also other thinking, other interventions that exactly stress the need from health from below, that in the sense of self-activity of vulnerable communities, and there are certain examples already. And it was Frederick Jameson some years ago that referred, by the way, to the Black Panthers as an example of dual power. And it was Alberto Toscano that suggested that this could be also the idea of a dual biopower, that is a way to really intervene into such questions of social reproduction. And I believe that these interventions help us actually think democratic biopolitics not as a simple demand for public health interventions from the part of the state, but as constant processes of subaltern struggle and confrontation with the limits of contemporary neoliberal states' response to the pandemic, based upon collective militancy, the democratization of knowledge and self-organization. And you can see the various ways that such an approach can take. For example, how do you redesign physical distancing or behavioral change measures when they are necessary in ways that are localized and adjusted to the realities of communities and persons? How do you implement such measures based on consent instead of coercion and avoiding the expansion of state surveillance? How do you include into the fight against the pandemic demands for more equality, less precariousness, better environmental conditions, especially since we know that inequality, precariousness, and bad environmental conditions have contributed to the pandemic. It also points how realizing that continuing such activities, such as education, can be equally important with suspending other activities. And how do you reorganize, how do you actually articulate demands to full health care, beginning, for example, with primary care? Or to take another example, how do you reorganize workplaces? Because there are workplaces that cannot be shut down because of their social usefulness. How do you reorganize safe practices? This cannot be just an idea through measures. This requires, forms of collective participation, discussion, and reorganizing by means of this discussion and participation of safer practices. Or to give another one of the a big challenge that we have today. For example, by now we know that if we want to suggest an alternative to what we can describe as the horizontal general lockdown, which is currently being suggested in Europe as the only possible idea, that there is no alternative. If you want to suggest an alternative, that there is an alternative, and you say, okay, first we make sure that the vulnerable and the exposed are protected, first of all, which means, for example, that the vulnerable are not exposed, the elderly are not exposed, those with underlying conditions are not exposed. This requires a very big reorganization, not just of nursery homes, but also of the lives of many peoples or persons with health issues. We need networks of community-based solidarity, for example, so that you make sure that those that are living in their homes get what they want. Or if you want to have different forms of hospitality and fostering for those that live in cramped nursing homes, you need to be able to move them and put them in other places and make sure that they get the care they need and also the support from the community. Or if, for example, you decide that you do not want to have exposed workers in essential supposed workplaces despite their health problems, how do you deal with this problem? For example, because we know that one of the problems with the lockdowns is that it is much easier for young, healthy professionals, to stay at home and, do distance work from their computers, whereas you have people in the late 50s or 60s with health problems, doing manual jobs that are necessary, and they cannot, stay at home. So the rational thing will be okay, let's change roles. Let's make sure that everyone who is over some age does not work and get full paid leave, and those positions that do not need real specialization, get younger people with less health risks, try in safe, of course, with safety protocols, try to do this work. How do you reorganize that, not in a non-coercive way, with forms of participation and collective discussion? So I use this just as an example to see what democratic biopolitics is about. It's not just about, democratic decisions. It's about how we reorganize our lives in collective ways by means of participation, having the survival and the health and the good life of the subaltern classes in mind, but also by means of, doing it as a movement. So this is just an example of democratic biopolitics, which is exactly what the notion of a collective care for ourselves would mean. And it's also based on the assumption that in the medium and long run, greater social equality, greater social security, well-being, and also, emancipated sociality can save more lives than simply, just lockdowns, even with public health systems. So I think that to conclude, what I try to describe as democratic biopolitics is, in a certain way, the metonymy, another way of suggesting the urgent need for what historically has been called the left or the radical left or the communist movement or the socialist movement or whatever, in a conjuncture like the pandemic, in a conjuncture of profound social, economic, and hegemonic crisis, not just to articulate demands from the state, however important, I insist, demands from the state are and urgent, but also to have this confidence that it can point to a different way to organize society, even against a pandemic, that there is an antagonistic way to struggle against dangers such as the pandemic, an antagonistic way that is based on mass participation, increased rather than suspended solidarity and sociality, democratization of knowledge, a collective and community approach to these questions, and a way of organizing it that at least points to, has this tendency towards self-government, which is for me the essence of a potential communist governmentality, instead of simply demanding a more protective or even paternalist state. Not because we do not need to have demands from the state, but because we need to go beyond that if we really want to prove that, yes, another world and another way to fight the pandemic is possible. Thank you.
Sorry. So thank you, Panagiotis, for this great lecture. I managed to gather 4 questions. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you fine. Yes.
First, I believe that you already answered first and second question, but if you would like to expand a little bit more on the second question, I don't know. So if I may present the question to the general audience, Jaco Pasto is asking, could you also elaborate on the relationship between neoliberalism and biopolitics? So,
the relationship between neoliberalism and biopolitics is part of Foucault's research. Actually, Foucault reads one form of neoliberalism, the German ordoliberalismus tendency, which was discussed in the early 70s, which is slightly before the canonization of neoliberalism, which happens late 1970s, late 1970s, when what was until then called the Austrian school of monetarists and economists like Hayek, was projected as a more coherent program, and they found their poster faces in Margaret Thatcher and to a lesser degree Ronald Reagan. And Foucault realizes that there is something in the management of population and the management of market tendencies, that there are analogies. And he makes really interesting and fascinating remarks on how the management of risk in an endemic infectious disease like smallpox and its eradication, when you try to manage risk, not just raise a barrier. Quarantine is a barrier. You try to stop a transmission chain. Vaccination and inoculation works by reducing the possibility of infection, and also sort of a management of risk, which he calls also security. How this resonates with the market, and the same way that questions like scarcity in the 18th century start to be discussed as market phenomena, whereas until then they were discussed perhaps in more ethical ways. If there's scarcity, so that the economy can auto-regulate, etc., etc. So there is an analogy surely between this, and I think that's why I used this analogy with the Gramsci, which is perhaps rather daring, between biopolitics and hegemony, in the sense that they are both tentative experimental notions trying to see the complexity of the articulation of power beyond the simple conception of sovereign power. I mean, sovereign power is all present during the entire capitalist modernity, and even today it is, one might say, the hard metal of state power. But you need to see how management of risk, management of population, market itself is part of this nexus of power relationships. And I think this is the crucial point. And neoliberalism has this idea of biopolitics, and you can see in many discussions, both of questions of health, but in general, for example, take all this idea of individualized risk, even in the pandemic, despite the fact that the main measure adopted seems to be rather classical disciplinary measure, the quarantine or the lockdown or the stay-at-home order or the curfew or the suspension of some activities. See the dominant rhetoric. The dominant rhetoric is one of individual responsibility. This kind of individualized responsibility in the pandemic, this is a classical, neoliberal biopolitical kind of, say, attitude. So this is my analytical question. In regards to the political question, I try to answer it. I mean, whether Foucault also moved politically towards neoliberalism, I don't think that his work turns to that direction. We know that personally he's disillusioned by the radical movements, how the Iranian revolution and its evolution was also a shock for him, that in a certain way there is this very big debate on totalitarianism which also affects him, and in certain way one might say that he turns towards perhaps a more social democratic approach of a society with more rights. Foucault was never utopian in his thinking. His idea was not that you can have a society of full freedom, and you can have societies that become more freer as they progress historically. But this does not mean that his theoretical work points to his own political beliefs. I think that his theoretical work is more open, and we can reappropriate certain notions and try in a certain way to discuss alternatives. So this is my answer to the first question, and the second question between neoliberalism and biopolitics.
Biopolitics, yeah.
So yes, on the question, yes, I mean, of course, the third question, yeah, it is rather, which is about mainly how biopolitics has a negative connotation. I tried to offer, if I am allowed to say, a rather philological answer. I think that many of the remarks, many of the writings associated with a rather negative use of biopolitics mainly refer to aspects of disciplinary power. This is how it was incorporated. Biopolitics became rather started to be used already in the 1970s with reference to Foucault, references to the first volume of History of Sexuality. We must remember that people at that time would read, Discipline and Power and History of Sexuality as part of the same, research project, the same conceptual apparatus, although in fact there is some kind of transition from disciplinary power towards biopower and biopolitics. Even the definition, I think I read it, of biopower and biopolitics within the History of Sexuality Volume 1 is tentative. You cannot see very difference, and it's very easy to think that biopolitics usually is negative. And by the way, indeed, most forms of biopolitical practices, in 19th and 20th century were negative. Racism was a kind of negative biopolitics. We should never forget that colonialism and imperialism led to this quasi-scientific conception of races, which was exactly biopolitics. And And the history of medicine is full of such examples of how colonial views affected, the very conception of disease. To give an example, both in Europe in the late 19th century and in the US, again the same period, when you have the large big cholera outbreaks, the easy answer was to accuse the immigrants for that, and because they were supposed to be carriers of cholera, because they came from areas where cholera was still endemic. But it took some time to realize that it was not about the immigrants, even if they actually, some of them could be considered, actually came from areas with cholera. The problem was that there were no proper, running water systems, and sewage water was mixed with running drinking water, which is the basic way that cholera you can have a cholera epidemics in a city. And by the way, this is one of the examples. Most infectious diseases were not dealt with in early 20th and the first half of the 20th century by means of medical interventions, but by means of public health interventions that had to do with well-being. When people started having clean running water in their homes, this was a major breakthrough for health. On when they started to have central heatings in all places and have their own bathrooms and not have one bathroom per floor or per building, as it used to be in old European blocks or big buildings, etc., etc. So yes, there is. But what I'm saying is that we can. What it mean if you take the starting point of the idea of biopolitics, how a society, how within the context of a mode of production, you also have a politics of life. So if you try to think what into an antagonistic to capitalism form of production, what politics of life would be like, then you start to think about this idea of democratic biopolitics, which in a certain way, and this is the fourth answer, indeed will, the fourth question, sorry.
Okay, can I just, can I just read the question? Because I'm not sure if everyone follows the sequences. So Philip Steidl wrote, "Thank you for the pleasant lecture. Do you see a disciplinary moment aspect in, but not limited to, Foucault's notion of biopower?"
Oh, surely there is especially in the initial formulation of biopower, there is a strong disciplinary aspect, and in a certain way, one might say that you have, on the one hand, disciplinary biopower, anatomopolitics, and on the other hand, biopolitics proper, if we can use this distinction. But I would use that as a starting point to add something else, because this is part of the discussion. This is also part of the discussion on Giorgio Agamben's interventions. In a certain way, you cannot avoid some form of disciplinary or coercion or even coercive aspect when dealing in such questions. I mean, we're still talking about forms of power, and even within the context of communist governmentality, you would have some aspects, but the extent to which this is based on democratic participation, democratic decision, democratization of knowledge, which is a really, really important aspect, how people actually realize, know what is happening and try to adjust their lives, but also taking account of how they do not fully suspend their social lives. This can limit the amount of coercion or disciplinary aspect that can be included, and in certain cases this is also the only way to achieve it. To give an example, it's very easy to, for example, regulate movement in open space, especially in the cities. Cities are under surveillance, are under police surveillance. You 1, 2, 3, 4 times sort of people try to follow the rules. But if you go into a workplace, a big workplace, and you need to make sure that people follow certain rules, and practices are safer, which goes with all forms of safety and health within workplaces. Unless you try to organize it in a collective way, making it more practical, sometimes making it them even more flexible in order, to make sure that you get at least as the better result. You cannot have any result of safety, for example, in regards to the pandemic, and this is the main one of the problems that we're facing today. And if you don't call in the unions and try to discuss and say, okay, how we can organize it better, then you get, like rules and regulations that we know that sometimes turn to the other side, to the opposite side. People not following regulations whenever it is possible. So this is the idea of how you try to do it in a more democratic, participatory way, and also in the large scale, it is also a way to think, to think the big challenges. I tried to suggest one at the end of my speech. For example, if we did not opt for a lockdown and try to protect the vulnerable, whereas the less vulnerable try to continue, of course with safety, doing what is necessary for societies to go on. This is a major process of collective, reorganization that can only be accomplished by means of, collective democratic decision and participation. It cannot be done from the above. It's exactly the impossibility to do it from the above that leads to the idea of this horizontal lockdown, which of course has tragic results. To give a very simple and practical example, people like me, or people that are even younger than me, can do everything online. If you go to a supermarket, you can see older people, because they have to go to wait in line to do the simple shopping in a pandemic. The idea that, okay, and the market idea, the neoliberal idea is, okay, order it online. Supermarket, they cannot order it online. This is, someone must go take it. This is a small example of community self-organizing, where you can have younger people doing the shopping for others, and these are very small, and you have seen such small gestures or bigger gestures of solidarity, and of course, final point. Also, there is also a communist way, or as part of a communist governmentality, to assess risk. Sometimes, you cannot always avoid risk. Sometimes you assess it. And it was very important how people, for example, went out in the streets for Black Lives Matter. It's not that they were irresponsible and they didn't realize that perhaps this also poses a risk, although, of course, from right wingers and the Republicans and Trump, where it was exaggerated. But yeah, there was a certain risk. America has a very big pandemic, but people had this collective ingenuity and thinking to say, okay, there is a risk, but I think that other things are very important, because it's about lives get killed, and the need for social justice, and they went out. This is also part of a thinking within, let's say, a potential democratic biopolitics, that you also leave this space to people to make such choices based on their, collective solidarity, responsibility, and rationality.
The questions keep on coming. So do you believe you will still have energy to answer one?
Oh, sure.
No okay. Then the next question is from Ugo Rossi. His question is, how can we develop an alternative lexicon as well? The notion of responsibility is a pillar of neoliberal morality of active citizenship.
Well, we can always replace responsibility with solidarity. Solidarity is something different. Of course, there is a notion of responsibility that can be from the part of the subaltern classes, and the subaltern classes in their everyday collective practices and traditions of struggle have long traditions of solidarity. And they can even have it much more than the idea of active citizenship, because the neoliberal conception of active citizenship is not so much it's individual responsibility as individual duty as part of a society of individual monads, whereas we can point to a collective responsibility, which is based on the idea that we are part of a broader community, and we try to adjust the lives of this community to such ways that it can enhance, well-being and health for all of us. And as mentioned already, this even in very practical terms can be more effective if we look at the many pitfalls of the lockdown strategy. And I mentioned a very simple one. Right now, we have many in all advanced capitalist societies, because also something that we have forgotten, the expansion of working age. 20, 30 years ago, people over 60 were not working. Now people work until 67 in most European countries. And this is one of the most crucial groups. And if they do manual, tedious kinds of works, essential workers, supply chain workers, these are some of the most vulnerable categories to the pandemic. And I mean, collective responsibility and the idea of individual responsibility mainly, asks for them to take personal measures, whereas an idea of collective responsibility would be, okay, you do not work. If you're over 60, you do not work. And if your job is something relatively easy, we can find younger people to do it with proper protection. We have much smaller risk than the persons I see when I go to my neighborhood supermarket. Really friendly ladies. I know them for years, and they want the job. They cannot stop working until they have reached retirement age, but they are also exposed. So this is another way to think of forms of collective responsibility and really thinking about these others, because there's all this idea in the dominant discourse that, okay, we impose lockdowns because we care for the vulnerable, and at the same time the very same policies continue to expose the vulnerable to the risk not only of infection, but also, for example, the very big problem of all these medical therapeutic practices that have been suspended in order to have hospital space for COVID cases, etc., etc.
Okay, perhaps the last question posed by our colleague, Alexander Gortman. It's a long one, so I will try to read it all at once. Alexander wrote, "Thank you for your talk, Panagiotis. Your intervention is extremely vital, especially in articulating an ethics of militancy rooted in the possibility of living otherwise and organizing heterotopias. My question concerns the question of whether there are examples of elementary or nascent forms of this kind of alternatives. My question, ACT UP and the BPP represent fairly mature and well-developed examples of movements of this kind. Are there more elementary forms that we might learn from?"
Well, I think that if we look at different countries, you can see examples. This would also be an interesting, political research project. There were, especially during the first lockdown, in many countries, many small-scale yet important initiatives of local solidarity, especially in neighborhoods, difficulty attempts to make sure that, especially people that could not cater for the basic needs got what they wanted, or attempts to make sure that since some forms of social protection were not functioning, they did function, for example, delivering food to homeless. For example, in Athens, there were various initiatives to care for this problem, because part of the lockdown was the collapse of the official system of offering food to these persons, so someone should step in and do the job. And also other problems, and wherever there were, self-managed clinics and things, they were practiced, but not to the extent that it was necessary. And one might say that this has been one of the more problematic aspects of how the radical left whatever this means, of course, dealt with this issue. And I believe that one of the problem is that despite the fact that in the history of the working class movement, we have many examples of such alternatives, the main strategy was kind of an acceptance of the dominant lockdown strategy, of course, with demands for better, public health and support for public health workers. In that aspect, support for public health workers, the left globally has done a lot of work. And it's very important that we manage to, instead of the demonization of the public, that is the trademark of neoliberalism, it was evident that without a big, public sector backbone, a society would collapse, from hospitals to, social security, social services, etc., etc. But I mean, the next step, that step that points towards, self-organization, work from below, and evolving radical alternatives to that, my opinion is that the left globally did not fare so well. But I think that if we look at whatever examples there are, it's very interesting to study and, project them and find ways to learn from them. Yeah, there are experiments that we can learn from. And it's very important because we are entering into a second lockdown, and which would also have a very huge economic and social cost. And yeah, it is time that we also move to that direction.
Okay. I would like to thank you, Panagiotis, to be with us today and open our series of lectures. It was a very interesting lecture and the discussion, and I hope we can be our guest also in the future.
I would also like to thank you, and thank you for the people that watched it. I hope they find it interesting. Well, let's keep the struggle. Struggle is the only way for better health.
And one more thing before we go, I would like to invite everyone watching to join us next week on Thursday at 7. Next, I think our lecture will be Untitled Parrhesia, and the lecture will be held in a Slovenian language. So yeah, you can check out the event on Facebook or our webpage to see more details about her lecture. I think. Thank you.
Thank you.